2025 is looking to be the final year left for Dungeon Quest, with the game receiving less and less updates and losing more and more players. The future of the game has never looked worse. Now I want to begin with one of the biggest issues, which is the lack of updates that this game is receiving. We're already in February and we haven't received a single big update this year, with of course the biggest update coming 4 months ago, and of course being the Abyssal Void, which came out in October of last year, and since that dungeon we've basically received no updates. Now this is problematic because in the year of 2024 we were receiving a couple updates every month, and those updates were what were keeping the game alive. And of course the lack of updates is seeing Dungeon Quest lose a lot of players, with the game losing about 40% of its audience. And just Dungeon Quest 7 months ago was very often seeing 6 to 10,000 players, whereas now it's barely seeing 4K. Now this is a problem because when a game sees a lot less players, it often means that the developers will stop putting as much effort into it. And especially with a team like Voldex, who owns many other games, they will instead move their effort to games like Universal Football or Driving Empire, with numerous times more players than Dungeon Quest will ever get, because those games will see a lot more returns on making big updates than Dungeon Quest. Now another kind of huge issue with Dungeon Quest updates is of course the updates that we are getting are either just pay-to-win updates or updates that farm engagement. I mean, since the Abyssal Void, we've received an AFK mode and playtime rewards, along with Dungeon Quest Plus, all of which are updates that either bank on pay-to-win or engagement, which ultimately makes the devs more money. And this really does kind of suck because Dungeon Quest in 2024 did actually see a lot of good updates. I mean, we saw things like Greg, the boss raids rework, and of course 2 old dungeon remakes, which was actually a lot. And because of Dungeon Quest's inability to satisfy players, many people are switching to alternative dungeon RPG games, with a huge one of course being Fabled Legacy, which is basically Dungeon Quest but actually gets non-pay-to-win updates, and the newly released Arcane Conquest, which already at this point is rivaling the player count of Dungeon Quest. Now these games of course have their own flaws and in a lot of ways can't match Dungeon Quest. However, it really shows that players are willing to switch to other games that just do things better than Dungeon Quest. But subscribe if you think I should switch from Dungeon Quest. Another kind of huge thing with these Dungeon Quest alternatives is just the progression in general. I mean, Dungeon Quest can take upwards of 100 hours to get to the max dungeons, whereas games like Fabled Legacy and Arcane Conquest don't require players to dedicate as much time. And this brings me on to one of the biggest issues that I want to cover, which is of course the progression system. Now I and many other players truly believe that Voldex would immediately fix the progression system after VCafe left, and unfortunately that really hasn't been true, where the game is basically just as difficult to get pro as it was years ago. And this unfortunately means that most players aren't even the highest dungeon, which means that they cannot experience updates like the Abyssal Void or anything like the major content changes. And of course, the only way to get pro in this game is to either be like one of the godliest players ever, or to simply just walk around and ask people for carries. I've mentioned it before, but this is truly what I think is the biggest thing holding back Dungeon Quest, where players just simply feel stuck in these older dungeons, causing them to either dedicate their lives to grinding the game or just immediately quit. Now, games like Blox Fruits can get away with doing this sort of thing, but that's because the game's content actually has more to do than just farming dungeons 24/7. And games like Arcane Conquest are just simply a lot more beginner friendly. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the repetitive nature of the game. Now this is something I'm sure you've probably heard a million times, and you've probably felt over the last few months, where not only is there just basically nothing to do when you actually get high level, but all of the updates are basically the same thing, like the same events, or the same dungeon cycle. And the unfortunate thing is that it wasn't like that last year. Last year, we were receiving so many different changes, like crafting, of course, boss raids, quests. Many things in this game changed, and it gave a lot of variety to the game, where it didn't feel like the same thing over and over again. And really, the solution to this problem is to just like implement new kind of major changes to freshen up the game for players. Because even for me, like, I don't even touch this game outside of content simply because of the fact that there's literally nothing to do. And this is the exact same way for most higher level players. And I think the developers know that people are kind of tired of playing the game, which is of course why they release daily playtime rewards and things like the AFK mode, to basically just artificially gain the players who don't play the game due to its repetitive nature. Now, another thing that hugely concerns me about the state of Dungeon Quest is the fact that the developers have not responded on anything. I mean, if you even just look at the community response for Dungeon Quest, like downfall of Dungeon Quest, downfall of Dungeon Quest, like Dungeon Quest downfall has really just become a huge trend for this game. With of course, like my video being probably one of the most popular videos that has released over the last month. And yet with all of this, the developers have not done anything to kind of ease our worries. In fact, quite the opposite, where they have just been radio silent, not saying a word about the clear elephant in the room. And this makes players like me very much worry about Dungeon Quest kind of doubling down on the issues with the game, and just implementing more pay to win, and more engagement farming systems. Or even worse, putting less effort into this game to instead transfer to their other games with many more players. And you astute observers might see a cycle going on here, where because Dungeon Quest is receiving less updates, it's receiving less players. And of course, having less players causes the game to receive less updates. And Dungeon Quest's pretty big drop off in players paints a very clear picture. And truly what I think would actually kind of fix this game would of course be the removal of pay to win updates, which I've already said before, or as well just making them a lot less impactful, which hugely helped the game. But the main thing just being more kind of big major updates. I mean, it's been 5 years and the Excalibur quest still is not completable. So we could see that. We could also see reworks to dungeons. But unfortunately, I doubt the developers will do these sorts of updates purely because of the fact that they don't generate money. Instead, they will move to other things like events or engagement updates, which will actually generate them a lot of money. And I think games like Arcane Conquest will continue to grow in size, acting as the replacement for Dungeon Quest. Because let's be real here, I do not think that Dungeon Quest is gonna improve that much, as I think the developers are more focused on making money than putting out quality updates. So as for the idea of 2025 being the end for Dungeon Quest, I think it is actually somewhat likely. But ladies and gentlemen, I have another video on the screen for you guys, so definitely go check it out because I think you'll probably like it. But for now, I'll see you guys later.